So we're going to start three categories. We're going to go back and do the same time period 3 times over. So we're going to do politics. I know I'm writing on the board after I told you I'm not going to write on the board, but I'm just writing these categories. So we're going to do politics, and then we're going to do industry, which is economic stuff. Yeah. Politics, industry, and then the last thing we're going to do is urbanization, which is cities. Urbanization. And we're going to talk about this from 1860. Your textbook goes 1869, but we'll say 1865, end of the Civil War, all the way up through 1900. Keep in mind that this process of urbanization is ramping up in this time period, but it continues into the 1900s. In fact, I think by 1910, it's either 1910 or 1920, I'm pretty sure it's 1910, for the first time ever, more people live in the cities than live in the countryside, in rural areas. So this is not something that's contained to this. This is not just something that's contained to this time period, but we're going to talk about it within this time period. In fact, Standard Oil is, the Standard Oil Trust isn't dissolved until 1909, I think, is when it's dissolved, and that is under Taft. So this is the rise of big business, the rise of corruption in politics, and the rise of... Here, your textbook calls the first part of politics political paralysis in the Gilded Age. Here are some major things, and before you write this down, I'm going to read it once. What we need to do. The post-Civil War era is rife or has a lot of corruption, graft, and influence peddling. Corruption is rampant at the local and state levels as well. The infamous New York City political party machine known as the Tweed Ring, for example, it takes millions of dollars from the city and state and puts it into the pockets of corrupt politicians. So one thing is you have corruption at the national, state, and local level. At the local level, at the state and local levels, you have political machines, which are politicians who get reelected over and over and over and over again and almost are always associated with the Democratic Party. Political machines, especially at the local level, rely on immigrant voters. They rely on bribes and corrupt voting tactics to stay in power. They pay off people to vote for them. They give lucrative contracts to their friends to do city work. For example, there's the most famous example is in New York City. The state courthouse is constructed. It should have cost a couple $100,000. It winds up costing like some $7 million by the time they're done. They're overpaying everyone to do the work. And if you're getting paid a lot of money, you're going to vote for these people. And by the way, you're going to give some of your fat paycheck back to them. It's called a kickback. Did we talk a little bit about those? So one is corruption at the national, state, and local level. You start seeing pressure on politicians to pass laws that favor these people. So you have state, local, and even national politicians being paid off and bribed and influenced by big businesses to pass laws favorable. You even have judges, the courts at local, state, and national levels, mostly at the state and local levels, being influenced by big business as well. Number 2, in an attempt to clean their own house, the Republicans took steps to lower the protective tariff, which many considered unreasonably high and beneficial to specific industries. In addition to the lower tariffs to address the problem of favoritism in attaining government employment, Republicans also passed civil service reform in the Pendleton Act. Do you remember the spoils system we talked about? So this time period, 1890, the Pendleton Act is when is it? It's Chester A. Arthur. So that would be the 1880s. I think Pendleton is 1883, where we have civil service reform, meaning you could not because they gave you money. You had to apply There was an actual application process, and they're trying to clean up the spoil system that had endured ever since presidency. Another thing, a devastating depression hit the nation in 1873. So there's the Panic of 1873, which causes lots of unemployment and the failure of many banks. And another big one is farmers began to organize in response to their economic woes during this time period. This is the Grange, Farmers Alliance, and then eventually the Populist Party. During this time period, politics-wise, yeah.
Did the Populist Party form yet at this time?
1890 is when the Populist Party forms. And the Populist Party is going to really, really, really rise up between 1890 and 1896. That's like their time period. The Grange and the Farmers Alliance, which were like precursors. Do you know that word, precursors? Something that came before. The Populist Party were in the 1870s and 1880s. So it's a gradual increase in rise in prominence, and then it culminates with the formation of the Populist Party. When's the Omaha Platform? That's 1892, I think it is. I believe, is the Omaha Platform, which the Populist Party lays out their political platform. Do you remember the Populist Party platform? Direct elections of senators, shorter work days, government control of the railroads. What else? Huh? Oh, free coinage of silver. Railroad. Oh, yep. An income tax, a graduated income tax. All that stuff. Okay. Yeah.
What year was the civil service reform you were talking about?
1883. It's the Pendleton Act. Another thing that's really important politically. At the national level, the Democratic Party struggled. The Democratic Party struggled at the national level. And this should make sense because post-Civil War, the Republican Party was the party of the North. There were only 2 Democrats elected. There were 2 Democrats elected between 1860 and 1912. One of those 2 is going to be Grover Cleveland. The second is Woodrow Wilson. So only 2 Democrats between the end of the Civil War and Woodrow Wilson. Examples of corruption at the national level would include the Teapot Dome scandal. Oh, no. I'm so sorry. That is not. That is with Harding. At Grant's Credit Mobilier, that's what it's called. I couldn't think of the name of it. Do we talk about the Credit Mobilier scandal at all? It's CRED, Credit Mobilier. It might be even Credit Mobilier. I know it's a French word. Stop saying. Credit Mobilier. Do you know what industry? It's the railroad industry. And what was happening is the federal government was giving money to railroad companies to spur the building of railroads post-Civil War. One of the railroad companies developed, it's a fake company called Credit Mobilier. And this fake company, it charged the government exorbitant amounts to build these railroads. And the government was paying it, and some senators were getting kickback money. And the scandal broke. All you need to know is that it was a corruption scandal involving railroads in the government, in the national government. There's another big scandal involving the Secretary of the Interior, I believe. Maybe it was the Secretary of War, with Native Americans. Native American aid that was supposed to be going to a Native American reservation was actually being pocketed by Grant's administration officials. There was also corruption that went on in the economy. This is the cornering of the gold market by Jay Gould and Robert Fisk. Do you remember this? Just know it's a scandal in which they tried to drive up the price of gold and then become rich by doing it. These two men it's called cornering the gold market. They basically tried to artificially inflate the prices of gold and then sell all of their shares of gold and make a bunch of money off of it, causing massive losses for other people who owned gold at the time. And the other thing during this time period, politics-wise, 1877 marks the end of Reconstruction, in which the removes troops from the South and the federal government abandons its effort to ensure the gains made for African Americans. This Jim Crow laws being passed by state and local governments in the South, and you go back to a very segregated, very racist, very a society that is preventing African Americans from having any economic or political opportunities for the most part. All right. I think that's all I have for that. Do you want me to read you? This is kind of nice. I've never used this resource before. I'm just kind of vetting it, but I like that they do it chapter by chapter. They have a whole chapter summary. You want to read the whole chapter summary of politics in the Gilded Age? Should we just skip it and go on to the next thing? Do you want me to read one and see if... After the soaring ideals and tremendous sacrifices of the Civil War, the post-Civil War era was generally one of disillusionment. Politicians from the White House to the courthouse were often surrounded by corruption and scandal, while actual problems afflicting industrializing America festered beneath the surface. The popular war hero Grant was a poor politician. His administration was rife with corruption. Despite occasional futile reform efforts, politics in the Gilded Age was monopolized by two patronage-fattened parties which competed vigorously for spoils while essentially agreeing on most national policies. Cultural differences, different constituencies, and deeply felt local issues fueled intense party competition and unprecedented voter participation. Periodic complaints by, we didn't talk about this, mugwump reformers and soft money advocates failed to make sense of politics. The deadlock of 1876, did we talk about the 1876 election which led to the compromise of 18? Samuel J. Tilden is the Democrat. Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican. It's such a close election that they don't know who won. There's disputed returns in guess what state? Disputed voting counts. Florida. And they literally don't know who won. And they send the disputed results to Congress. They Republicans and Democrats and say, we're going to be Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to win this election. But if that back negotiation between Republicans and Democrats. An oppressive system of tenant farming and racial supremacy and segregation was thereafter fastened in the South, enforced by some racial prejudice. 1880s. Assassination was by a disappointed office seeker spurred the beginnings of civil service reform, which made politics more dependent. That's a big important sentence right there. When you stop granting government positions and doing favors for your own political party, when that is ended, politicians politicians looked elsewhere for contributions for their campaigns. Like, if I can't promise you a job for contributing to my campaign, now you look elsewhere. The Pendleton Civil Service Act also correlates to when businesses started contributing more money to politicians and political campaigns. And so as the spoil system goes away, government partnering with businesses and business leaders starts becoming more and more prevalent. Does that make sense? That's all, that's it. That's the whole thing. Let's do industry. People you need to know and things you need to know about industry. Who, by the way, who's the leader of the New York City political machine? Boss Tweed. Do you remember the cartoonist and newspaper writer that exposed his corruption? Yeah, Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T, Thomas Nast. He's the one that exposed the Boss Tweed ring and is credited with exposing all the corruptions. By publishing articles in the newspaper and pictures. A lot of the people that were being taken advantage of were immigrants who couldn't read or write. And so Boss Tweed at one point has this quote saying, "I could care less what they write about me in the newspapers. It's those damn cartoons that they're drawing, which my constituents can actually understand," because they couldn't read. A lot of them. Not all. Okay, let's do industry and urbanization. Enormous immigration happens during this time period, especially from down workers' wages. Wages overall between 1865 and 1900 decreased, especially in industry. Mass production means cheaper goods, which means less money available to pay to workers, and the presence of low-skilled jobs drives down worker wages. Also, railroads facilitated transportation of people and made the train and railroad industry a powerful industry itself. The government played a major role in the railroad's development by providing land and money and loans, land and loans to railroads. This is an important one, the next one I'm going to read. By the turn of the 20th century, so by 1900, most major important industries had been controlled or were being controlled by economically and politically powerful trusts. They're controlled by trusts. Trusts and other types of business combinations undermine the foundation of capitalism, which is competition. So the whole goal of a trust is to suppress competition, expand your business, expand your influence, and limit competition. Trusts are going to be companies that become large. They buy up other companies, force smaller companies out of the market. They work together within their industry to limit competition. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Will we need to know like vertical and horizontal?
That vertical and horizontal integration is the tactics by which big businesses eliminated competition. They expanded and became bigger by. Do you want me to explain horizontal and vertical integration real quick? Just real fast. So, horizontal integration is tire right? One store, it's a tire store. And then they open another tire store. They open another tire store in another town. And then all of a sudden they eliminate the Midwest. And they open huge rubber factories that are making tires, and they make tires cheaper than anyone else, and they dominate that industry. That's horizontal integration. They are than anyone else. Vertical integration is when you do all steps to the process. So now we're talking like car companies. They are going to make their own tires, their own car parts, their own everything, and they make cars from start to finish, and they get really good at that. The example back then, Carnegie, he was the steel guy. Yeah. Carnegie, he started making steel, and he built these big steel factories that produced massive amounts of steel. And then what he did is he wound up buying his own iron ore mines. And then he started buying his own ships to transport the iron ore. And then he started making his own railroads to transport the iron and then to the steel factories, and from the steel factories to the market with these steel beams. And so he did everything. He did all steps from mining to transporting to making the steel to transporting the steel to cities and doing it all from step one to step. That's vertical, when you do all steps to the process. And it allows you to make more profits. Yeah.
Does vertical have to be like in that same industry? Could you go like in something else? Like let's say it wasn't just about like the production of steel, but you wanted to make like clothes or something too.
Sure. Usually when we talk about horizontal and vertical integration, it's all in one industry. But that doesn't mean once you've made it so big in one industry, you can't get into another industry and then start vertically and horizontally integrating in that industry. Does that make sense? Good question. Yeah.
Which one was legal and which one was illegal?
Both of them were legal. Both of them were legal throughout much of the Gilded Age. It is not until the Progressive Era that we start seeing restrictions. The first restriction is going to be the Sherman Antitrust Act. Can anyone look up when the Sherman Antitrust Act was, the year? Huh? No, that's Clayton. Clayton. Is it the 18? Let's find out. 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act. Antitrust Act. It was a law that passed that had no teeth, none. It was meant to regulate trusts. It didn't do it effectively. The Clayton Act was meant law to regulate. Companies began regulated, not necessarily from the executive branch and the president's administration, but how? They are going to try, they're not going to have a lot of success. It's through the courts, right? Suing these companies and through the courts. So alongside with these laws, you also are going to have lawsuits brought about them. Yeah.
Two questions. Who is the guy that went and sued a bunch of people?
Taft. Yeah, Taft. So he's the first guy on the back wall with the mustache. Taft. William Howard Taft is known as the trust buster. He sued over 40 some odd companies, and he didn't personally, but his attorneys brought lawsuits against about 40 big businesses during the time period, including U.S. Steel, including Standard Oil.
And like the trust what was the exact definition?
Okay, let's look up, let's go into the book and get you the exact definition. Essentially, it's when a business find out how it's defined in your book. 'Cause it's good. Okay, ready? Okay, so a trust is, and I'm going to read you the book's definition, and then I'm going to explain it in like normal people terms. Book says, trust, a mechanism by which one company grants control over its operations through ownership of its stock to another company. The Standard Oil Company became known for this practice in the 1870s as it eliminated its competitors by taking control of smaller oil companies. What that means is this. One company would buy a majority of other companies' stock so that it controlled decision makings for other companies. It is essentially like having a governing board of people that is going to control a whole industry. So let me give you an example. Standard Oil was the biggest oil producer in the whole entire country. They would go to smaller oil refineries. You can either work with us or we're going to put you out of business. You're going to sell a majority of your stock shares. We're going to keep your name. We'll allow you to retain, Ryan's Oil Refinery. So now Standard Oil, we have Ryan's Oil Refinery, we have Chris's Oil Refinery, Jake's Oil Refinery, Teresa's Oil Refinery. You're all time producers. I am Standard Oil. Now I'm going to let you keep control. But however, we're going to tell you how much you're allowed to produce, how much you should sell for. If we say that you should help us in this practice, you're going to do so. And if you try and do anything to the contrary, we're going to buy you out. We'll lower our prices to outcompete you. We'll put you out of business. Does that make sense? Think about all the Catholic schools around this area, right? CC and Divine Child and Brother Rice and I don't know, Mercy and we could do all these, right? If there was a Catholic schools board that controlled all of the policies and all the things that happen at the Catholic schools, and if any of the Catholic schools try to say, no, we don't want to offer Latin classes, and they're like, no, you're going to offer Latin classes, and if not, we're going to make it so that your enrollment will tank in the next 2 years, and you're not going to be able to operate and open. It would be like a Catholic school trust. The trusts, right? The trust would also lobby politicians, right? So lobbyists would represent the trust, the oil trust. Hey, you need to make laws that are beneficial to the oil industry. And so trusts become very powerful. It happened in the steel industry, the oil industry, the meat packing industry, the like fruit industry. I mean, all the sugar industry, railroad industry, all had trusts, meaning a group of people or a company, one company that was basically making the decisions and eliminating competition in the industry as a whole.
What was the economic kind of firm that you did? What was the point of that?
With the fat people sitting in the, which one?
It was the bad trust, good trust, and then was it Roosevelt on the good trust?
So Roosevelt said basically this, that trusts, one of the things that trusts did was they were very efficient in making their industries produce stuff, which means they could make cheap goods. That's a good thing. When you expand it, like we like Walmart, even though we like big superstores because they're cheaper. Does anybody shop like Kroger or Meijer? Those are regionally known stores. They're pretty cheap. Does anyone do shopping at Hiller's? Right? More expensive. Not a lot more expensive, but more expensive. If you have it can offer things. But if it starts eliminating competition and then raising prices to maximize its own profits, now it's not being good for the consumer. Roosevelt went after trusts that say that there's good trusts and bad trusts. Trusts in general, yes, they make prices lower, they maximize efficiency, they make the most out of the materials and things they have. But as soon as they start engaging in shady business practices, they need to be regulated and they need to have a watchful eye. Roosevelt would say Standard Oil was probably a bad trust because of all of the shady business practices it was doing. The trust then would work together and say like, okay, the oil trust is going to negotiate price stuff with the railroad so that we get the best railroad prices and things like that. Yeah.
Are trusts illegal today?
Yes, absolutely. So have you heard Time Warner and Xfinity are trying to merge? Has anyone heard this? So Xfinity and Time Warner are trying to merge into a super cable company, essentially. The federal government before this purchase can happen, before this merge can happen, the federal government's investigating whether or not they'd have too much influence. They'd be a monopoly in the cable industry. And it looks like they're going to not allow it to happen, and it looks like they're going to stop the purchase and the merger from happening. So yes, there's antitrust laws that are very much so still in play today, yeah.
How is that different from like Fiat buying out Chrysler?
Because there are still other major car companies. There's enough competition that is not. I mean, Fiat, think about it. Fiat had barely even broken into the U.S. market when it bought out Chrysler, and so it's considered a merger. But it's not like Chrysler and Fiat held 70% of the market share in cars. You still have Ford and GM and Toyota and Hyundai and Mercedes and Audi and all that stuff. Yeah.
So is it only a trust if it's like monopolistic?
So it becomes a trust when it becomes a monopolistic and it has too much market share. Yep. But back then, they didn't have laws to prevent them from becoming that big. Yeah.
Two things. One, like, why do you like need a board of directors if like whoever owns most of the stock makes all the decisions?
Good question. So the way they used to do it is they would say, if you are going to merge with a company, right? The decision process would have what was called a board of directors, a board of trustees. Have you ever heard of the board of trustees? Have you heard that term? It comes from the word trust. They would not of directors making decisions, but the thing Rockefeller would send his own men and place his own men in companies, and they would become the board of trustees, and so essentially Rockefeller's pulling the strings of what decisions are being made. It was all like a sham, a farce to make it look like these companies had a say over what happened to them, but they really didn't.
And then two, like, what did the Clayton Antitrust Act like do to strengthen the Sherman Act?
It gave the federal government more ability to prosecute and file lawsuits against what trust could not do. Does that make sense? And so I don't know exactly what it did, but it strengthened the federal government's ability to prosecute and file lawsuits against companies, and it also made the rules stricter on what businesses couldn't do. Okay, good questions. I'm sorry that this is taking a little bit of time, but it's stuff that we need to know. You could see a DBQ on this time period. Industry comes of age. The Gilded Age, a couple more points. The Gilded Age is dominated by key industrialists and financiers. Do you know who the biggest of the banking moguls is? JP Morgan. Yep, that's someone you should know. He actually is going to wind up not only dominating the banking industry, he buys Andrew Carnegie's Steel, Carnegie Steel, and he turns it into U.S. Steel. So JP Morgan he's going to be a key player. These industrialists and financiers are so enormous, and they have so much wealth, and they control business capital and political influence so much that many refer to them as robber barons. That's where the term robber barons comes from. Yeah. Industrialists and financiers. Large industrialists and large financiers. Financiers is Financiers. Financiers are so enormous, control so much wealth, and so much political influence. They're so large, control so much wealth, and have so much political influence, many refer to them as robber barons. Yep, you're welcome.
And that's derogatory,
Huh?
is the term robber barons derogatory?
Yeah, absolutely. It has a negative connotation. If you are talking about these people, and you're like, listen, these people create jobs, they're good. You call them captains of industry. They're captains. Those negative towards them say, no, they're robber barons. They're captains of industry. That would be like, never mind. One, industrial development was uneven, especially in the South. So this industrial revolution was not even throughout the country. It was mostly the would be Detroit, one of these places that is going to be industry centered, especially with after 1900 with the cars. Industrial development also caused worsening working conditions. Many workers attempted to unionize. However, big businesses refused to recognize the legitimacy of the unions, and the courts almost always sided with businesses. So workers tried to unionize, businesses tried to not recognize those unions, and courts almost always sided with businesses. Workers would also strike. An example of this is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And once again, the government sided with the companies. In fact, in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes sent in the Federal Army to stop striking workers, and workers died during the railroad strike. Do you know many big business owners and capitalists? What theory or what belief did they use to explain this growing gap between the rich and the poor? Social Darwinism, right? Like, people are born with a chance to succeed. Those that work hard do, and those that don't. Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right term, but are carpetbaggers and like.
That's Reconstruction. That's going to be during Reconstruction. If you stick around for a second, I'll answer the carpetbaggers and scalawags one in a second. It doesn't pertain to this. And then last stuff about urbanization. Some good people to know, by the way, during the industrialization bit. You should know, remember we talked about Horatio Algiers? He did the Rags to Riches story. He was a writer. He was a writer that promoted social Darwinism. A writer essentially promoted social Darwinism. Thomas Edison is a big deal this time. He 1930. He's right in this time period. Andrew Carnegie. Samuel Gompers. Anyone know why he's? You know, he the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. What major labor union? Knights of Labor. Which labor union allowed diverse women? It's Knights of Labor was come one, come all, very much so. They were considered, they got a bad rap for being associated with anarchists and radicals. There was a bombing. Do you guys remember the Haymarket Square bombing? And then the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, tried to basically create labor unions that were based on skilled workers, organized by industry, and they were more inclusive, more exclusive. So women couldn't join, African Americans couldn't join. Samuel Gompers is going to be the one that's the leader, the longtime leader of the AFL. All right, we're almost done. Almost done. Yeah.
Who was the photographer?
Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. He's the one that's considered a muckraker or a progressive that's taking photos of slums. He's going to be in the next. He's going to be in the next one. Yeah.
Is this the period where also Ford comes along?
Who?
Ford?
Oh yeah. So, but Ford is going to be making cars in the beginning in the 1910s and 1920s is when they really take off. I think he forms Ford I think Ford failed once before Ford actually became successful. I think it's the first 2 decades of the 1900s is when Ford is starting his Ford Motor Company, and especially is growing in the 19-teens. Yeah.
Who wrote the book of like Diamonds or something? Diamonds.
Oh, no, you're talking about Acres of Diamonds? It's not a book, it's a sermon. And his name is Russell Conwell. Yeah, Russell Conwell. Acres of Diamonds. Good job, man. It's good. See ya. Thanks for coming. Russell Conwell. Acres of Diamonds. He basically says, yeah, there's a reason rich people are rich. They're the best people in the country. They work hard. That's what happens when you work hard and you're good. You get rich. God loves you. If you're an alcoholic and poor and not working hard, you're going to be poor because God hates you. That's basically what Russell Conwell says. And by the way, you should pay your ministers a lot because the best ministers are the ones who are highest paid. It's funny. It's funny. All right. Last couple things. Urbanization. Industrialization fuels urbanization. Industrialization fuels urbanization. That's a big time one. 2, cities become magnets for immigrants because the jobs that most immigrants are taking are low-skilled jobs in factories. Factories are fueling the rise of cities. From 1900, those who can afford to leave the inner cities are, and we start to see the first suburbs forming outside, just outside cities. When do the suburbs really take off? 1950s, after World War II. But we're going to see the first suburbs starting to happen during this time period from around the turn of the 20th century. After 1880, like 1880 onward, we have a new wave of immigrants coming in, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. So 1880s, 90s, 1900s, and the 19-teens. Those 4 decades, 1880 to 1920. So 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, and 19-teens. We have major waves of immigrants coming to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. You get the poor housing. Do you remember what poor housing was in the inner cities? Those were settlement homes meant to help those that were living in these other tenement homes, tenement housing, T-E-N-N. No, I'm sorry, it's T-E-N, one N, E-M-E-N-T, tenement houses. They were poor housing for many immigrants and factory workers. Yep. Mm-hmm. He was taking pictures of tenement houses. During this time period, black leaders suggest various ways to defeat racism. The 2 key people you need to know would be Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So it's W.E.B. D-U space B-O-I-S, Du Bois, are 2 of these black leaders that are advocating for or suggesting ways to defeat racism. Booker T. Washington, his approach is a gradualist approach. Washington is all about educate African Americans to help themselves, teach them skills, and they can help get themselves out of poverty, right? If all you know is farming and sharecropping, that's all you're going to do. Get them education, they will be able to do things and make a better life. W. more confrontational approach. He is advocating, no, it's not education first, and this gradual integration into wants to secure the right to have their right to vote. Although you should know that the 15th Amendment is supposedly granting African Americans the right to vote. It's not happening after Reconstruction. Do we know that?
Exactly
intimidation, that kind of stuff. Muckrakers work to expose some of these poor conditions. This is Reese, Jane Addams, Ida Tarbell. How'd the race go?
Still haven't run yet.
Oh, really? Bummer.
It's taken a while.
Wow. Okay, so, and then lastly, the foundations of the women's rights movement occur during the 19th century, during this time period. The struggle over women's suffrage is one facet of the strain between those who identified with the notion of the old Victorian womanhood with those who celebrated the new American woman. So this is a struggle for women and the seeds of the women's rights movement. Oh, also a big thing. 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois helped found a black civil rights organization called the NAACP. Okay. The National Association for the Advancement, so the 4 doesn't have a letter, for the Advancement of Colored People. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. All you need to know is the NAACP, though. You wouldn't. I think that's about it. The one other thing that would be important to know about urbanization and industrialization is that this also affects culture, too. When you have Americans living in cities, you get this very new culture that grows out. Industrialization also promotes this idea of leisure time. You work for a set amount of hours, and then you have leisure time afterwards. This is the rise of national sports and popular culture like baseball. This mirrors the rise of as electricity becomes more widely available around 1900 and onward, especially in the 19-teens and 20s, you get this like really rich culture and night develops. The 19-teens and 20s, jazz is going to come on, but this is a little earlier than that. All right, that's Gilded Age stuff. Yeah. All right, thanks. I say we stop that one.